Hello and welcome to the Breathe Better podcast. I'm Gareth Jones. I have been a yoga teacher for about coming up to 4 years in June. That'll be the June of 2024. And I've been practicing for about 10 years. So at the moment, I teach part-time and I'm a waiter in my spare time, basically just to get to pay the bills, essentially, as if any of you are other yoga teachers out there listening to this, I'm sure you'll be aware, or anyone currently living in a cost of living crisis, it's kind of essential to have to work a little bit harder just to survive. So what I'd like to share within this podcast, is essentially all things about yoga, the ins, the outs, the history, the philosophy, what I've come to encounter on my journey so far over the past decade, what my practice looks like, little tidbits that I can share, little tips, segments of the things that I've learned so far, and just a lot of other different things, maybe not necessarily about yoga, but things that have come up on this sort of 10-year journey so far, because my life has changed rather drastically since I started practicing yoga. So when I first started practicing, I was actually a chef, and I was still training to be a chef as well. And the main reason that I started yoga was I'd heard that it could be essentially tone up your muscles. So I was trying to lose a bit of weight, and I was running, and I was doing yoga on the rest days to try and tone up muscles and to stretch a little bit more. And I was doing it off an app on my phone. Like, I had absolutely no idea what I was getting into at all. And oh Lord, if I only knew back then what I was getting myself into. And yeah, that's essentially how it started out. And I only ever went to my first class a couple of years later when my partner at the time took me along. And the first class I went to was an Ashtanga Vinyasa class. I don't think it was a full primary series, but it was just an Ashtanga Vinyasa class. And I can only vaguely remember that class. I remember being outside. It was in the woods under this little canopy, and it was such a nice setting for it. And I really do miss that setting for those classes. It was really good. But I remember that feeling after the first class of just a little bit lighter, a little bit more space, and a little bit less noise in my head. And I'll always remember that sort of feeling. And of course that carries over. So at this point, this is when we started practicing quite a lot, and me and my partner practiced quite a lot. Her being the biggest influence and the biggest drive as well for that, I will admit that. And it created a bit of a joy in me to keep practicing, and it was the first time I've ever actually enjoyed any form of exercise, I guess, because asana really at that point with Ashtanga Vinyasa is quite like an exercise class. And this was the first time I'd ever actually enjoyed exercise. I used to hate, gym class in school. I used to hate, exercise in general. I didn't like lifting weights. I didn't like running. I didn't really like any of these things. So I started running, and I was running at the time because it was good for me, but it didn't last long. And since then, yoga is the only thing that's actually stuck. I've tried climbing, I've tried cycling, I've tried running several times, and I'm still trying to actually continue in running. And nothing's stuck. But yoga is the one thing that has kept my interest. It's the one thing that's kept my attention this whole time, and it's the one thing that keeps pulling me back to practice. And I think that's pretty special. So I guess it all sort of started after that first class. And then, I kept going to the same teacher, started practicing the full primary series and started practicing a lot more. More turned into a lot more, and just became completely sort of obsessed with it afterwards. And eventually, of course, my partner and I split up at the time. And I really dove into, going to the gym and looking after myself and all this sort of stuff, or so I thought. And around that time was actually when there was a massive, massive shift and a massive deepening of awareness of what was actually going on with myself. And I'm still discovering that to this very day. But at the time, I was in a very, very dark place. I'd sort of come to terms with the fact that I could possibly be depressed, even though I didn't even want to label myself as that, because I felt guilty about labeling myself as something that I didn't know for sure that I might have been suffering from. And I knew that I was starting to suffer from anxiety. I was having panic attacks, anxiety attacks. I was getting chest pains. And at this time, I was actually working as a head chef. in the restaurant where we both worked. And I ended up leaving my work. I ended up handing in my notice. I couldn't stay there. We obviously ended up splitting up, and then I ended up moving back in with my parents. Now, for this time, it was extremely, extremely difficult, as you can imagine. So yoga was a nice little getaway. It was a nice little escape. At the time, anyway, it was a nice little escape where I could go, I could practice, and I could move my body, and I could feel something that wasn't necessarily just feeling shit, for lack of a better word. And I found great solace in that. And this is when I started to meditate as well. As I'd started to meditate maybe a couple of months before all this started to happen. And I started to experience a little bit of quiet, and my mood started to shift ever so slightly. Just in the sense that I could actually focus a bit more, and I could be a tiny bit more present. And I'm talking like maybe 5% more present than I normally was. I know it's a very difficult thing to measure, but I definitely felt a little bit more present in my life, and that was so profound. So profound for someone who's always had such a noise in their heads that they didn't even know was there. And it wasn't until I started meditating at this time that I actually realized how noisy my head was. I didn't realize, how busy my thoughts were and how hard it was to settle them. And of course, this is something that normally does happen for a lot of people, is when they start meditating that they realize how busy their head is and how many thoughts there are out there that are just scrambling around, and it's so noisy for a lot of people, and it's quite a big realization. So yeah, and then from there it just seemed to just snowball, and I just became more interested, more obsessed, and then started reading into a bit more of the philosophy, especially sort of looking into the Yoga Sutras, and quite a lot of watered down content that I was reading at the time, and sort of commentaries from people who had varying opinions and stuff like that. So it was this is when I started to sort of dive a bit deeper into it, and I guess it's led me to where I am just now. I kept practicing, of course, and I kept meditating, and then I sort of dabbled in a little bit of pranayama and breath work and stuff, but I didn't get it at the time. I didn't understand why I was doing it. I didn't understand the point of it. I understand, of course, why we done the asana was to sort of make ourselves supple, to make ourselves stronger, more flexible, more capable at just living daily lives and being able to sit for longer in meditation, of course. But meditation was very much just a silent affair. It was trying to still the mind and just focusing on your breath, or focusing on one little thing, one focus point or one anchor point, and just sitting with it and staying with it for as long as I could concentrate and as long as I could focus until you sort of sink into that space. But pranayama, I just didn't have a clue with. I just didn't understand the process. I didn't understand what I should be doing. And that lasted a long time indeed, only until this past year. So I'd say for about 6 years, I didn't really have a clue about pranayama or how to do it. I couldn't find much information on it that was easy to understand and easy to translate into, practicality. So, yeah. And you'll notice with these podcasts that I will sort of go off on tangents and maybe come back to the point. I might not come back to the point at all, but I'll just sort of ramble on with little musings and bits and bobs and a bit of snippets, sorry. So I guess the journey that I'm trying to explain to you is the path to my teacher training. So my teacher training was 3.5 years ago. It was in June, and it was right in the middle of COVID. So we were all locked down, and we got the option. We could do it either online, or we could wait and we could do it in person. Now, I obviously chose to do it online because I was like, well, what am I doing anyway? I'm not doing much. I'm just sitting, staring at the wall. Playing video games, that sort of stuff, reading, just the usual lockdown sort of scenario with all the things you normally hear. So I thought it'd be a really good use of my time. And my God, it was. It was so fascinating. And there's a little funny story that I haven't really shared with anyone except a few people, especially anyone who was on my teacher training. So if anyone's listening to this might be a little bit of a funny story. So I used to smoke an awful lot of weed. I used weed as a coping mechanism for my mental health for since I was 18 and I moved into my first flat. It was either 18 or 19, I can't quite remember. But as soon as I was living on my own, I practically started smoking weed every day. And not just like a little bit, like a lot, to the point where I was just numbing, taking away all of those feelings and taking away all of those sort of thoughts that I didn't understand, and just had no clues even there to start with. So this is a whole different story, and I'll get into that at a different point. However, during lockdown, I tried to stop smoking because obviously I was by myself. I wasn't seeing anyone. I was just in a little flat by myself, tiny little flat, and I was a very anxious person. So when they told me I could only go out once a day, that's what I'd done. I've always been one for following the rules, even though I hated following the rules. I've always been one for doing it. So that's what I'd done, and I remember that it was coming up to that auspicious day for stoners of being 420, and little did I know that this was the day before my teacher training started. I had all but forgotten that it was starting on the 21st of the 4th month, whatever that is. January, February, March, April. So it was starting on the 21st, and little did I know. And the day before, I bought some weed, and it's a copious amount for it, and just to mark the occasion one last time for what I thought I would smoke. So I rolled myself this massive joint and sat and smoked it, and it wasn't until about halfway through, and I was way too high to be thinking about anything else, but this thought popped into my head, like, what date is it? I was like, hang on, so it's the 20th, so there's something happening tomorrow. And then I realised, and this was about halfway through the day, maybe 4 or 5 p.m, and I realised, and I got this massive shock of anxiety, and I just went into complete panic mode. So I pulled out all of the stuff that I was meant to be doing for my teacher training. I had, of course, done all the reading lists and stuff like that, and I was quite far into the reading lists and stuff. I wasn't behind necessarily, but I was like, what the fuck am I doing? It's the day before my teacher training, this really big day where I'm going to start to really cement all of these new habits and starting to look after myself and hopefully start to stop smoking and all this sort of stuff as well. Because it felt like such a contradiction, right? So someone who's about to do this big thing in sort of health and wellness and becoming a yoga teacher, and I still had all these flaws, and this continued to be a big theme for me for a long time, and it still does. Because there's this idea of someone who does this thing, who teaches, or I'm sure, or varying other occupations as well, that they're not necessarily perfect. That's not the word I want to use, but they don't have any bad habits, right? So, and that's such nonsense. Everyone has bad habits, but for me, this felt like such a clutch. It's like such a crux that I had that I really, really struggled with. But anyway, it was just such a funny scenario that I had such a state of panic, and total drove my anxiety through the wall. And after I'd settled, after I'd laid everything out, I sat there and I sort of calmed down a little bit. And then I looked over at this half-smoked joint and I thought, yeah, I'll just finish it. And it was just, the next day I started my teacher training. I was absolutely terrified. I'd never done anything like this. I was on Zoom with a bunch of people I'd never met. I'd only briefly spoken to, very, very briefly, just introduced myself to on WhatsApp or something. And there I was, hiding this extremely deep shame about myself that the day before I had smoked a joint. And I'm sure there's many stories all around the world of this happening, but for some reason I felt such a deep shame around this. And I just think it's quite a funny story that I never told anyone. I still hold it to such a sort of shameful memory, which I think is quite funny. But that, I guess, as a sort of jagged path, gets us to where I'd done my teacher training. Now, it was a week-long intensive, and then we met up, or we were meant to meet up, later on, but in person in Glasgow, but we never did. But we did sort of join groups with this other group of people doing the same teacher training at a different time, and we sort of all joined up and started doing it all on Zoom together later on. And it was such a transformational time to look really in depth at these philosophies and look really in depth at your life and start to try and implement such change. For what I thought at the time was quite positive, all of it seemed very, very positive. Some of it can very quickly transform into these sort of toxically positive traits that we can try and ingrained into ourselves, and this sort of not accepting parts of ourselves, much of it being very personal to me. And I'm not for one second saying that that was my teacher's fault or anything. That was just how I portrayed things and how I perceived things to be, which I later had to debunk in therapy. So yeah, that brought us to the teacher training, and it was such a remarkable time. It was such a really difficult time, but I remember there was a sense of arrogance. I had this little aura of arrogance, or maybe not even little, for all I know. But I remember feeling quite sort of knowledgeable at the time, because I'd read like one book on philosophy, and I'd already practiced pranayama and all this sort of stuff, yada yada yada, and all this nonsense that I told myself. And little did I know how little I actually knew about yoga. I knew nothing compared to, how big a topic and a thing yoga is. It is huge, and it still boggles my mind to think about how much of a massive topic it is. And even in recent studies that I've done in continued education and stuff, CPD and bits like that, there's scholars who I've been studying from who've been researching yoga for 20, 30 years, and they've only been doing, say, one text. There's one guy, Edwin Bryant, who's written a commentary on the Yoga Sutras, a very in-depth commentary, and a very, very good one at that, but very in-depth and very weighty. And I've recently done a course with him on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and I'm still not even finished it, for that matter. But there's something that he said within it, which was, and this is not in any way an exact quote, please don't take anything I say as an exact quote, because in my mind it just doesn't work that way unless I have the writing in front of me. And one thing he said is that if you're going to commit to something in yoga, if you're going to commit to one text, one philosophy, that's the way to do it. You can't, there's no way in this lifetime in particular, that you can study the entirety of yoga or look into the entirety of yoga. It is just not possible. There's just so much stuff. So if you want to get anywhere, you have to pick the one thing that resonates with you and stick with it. Try not to diverge from your path, and just stick to your path and just keep going and keep learning. Never for any one point think that you know more than anyone else, or that you know it all, because my God, do you not know it all at all. And I think this translates to everything, really, to life, is that, like, don't ever assume that you know it all. Don't ever have that sense of arrogance, or, I'm better than you because I know this or that. And that's definitely one of the pitfalls within yoga. Is it's come up with me a few times, not necessarily with the same thing, but the most common one being like, oh, I can perform this posture better than other people in the class, that means I'm better at yoga. It doesn't. It just means that you have a body that's more capable of performing that posture. And the same can be translated into, pranayama and stuff. How I thought I was more knowledgeable because I practiced, pranayama before my teacher training. And what a load of shite that is. What an absolute load of shite. And there's been so many learning points upon this journey that I think are very important to share. And I think it's important for me to be very vulnerable and to express all of these things that, are, I wouldn't necessarily say mistakes, but things that I guess mistakes, or things that I've got wrong. And when I put myself on a bit of a pedestal, when I had absolutely no right to do that. And if there's one thing that yoga teaches us, it's that we're all equal. We're all in this together. We're all connected. So, yeah, it's a difficult thing to work through. Yoga's a very difficult path to work through, and it's not all sunshine and roses and light and love and light and all that bollocks. It's much more than that. It's much deeper. It's hard. It's difficult. You'll see the dark sides of yourself if you're, really going into it and actually following yoga and practicing it, and not just using it as a movement program to get flexible. Once you start to look into it and you start to peel back the layers of yourself, it's hard. It's really hard, and you'll see things that you don't want to see, and things will come up that you didn't know were there, like arrogance, or that's the only thing that's coming up to my head at the moment, or ignorance, or pettiness, or bitterness, or spitefulness, or judgefulness, or so much, and you don't want to see it. You don't want to see those parts of yourself to start with, and part of the process is learning to accept those all parts of yourself, all versions of yourself that come up on the journey. So I guess in the 19 minutes that I've been talking and trying to do an introduction and sort of outline what I'm going to be talking about in yoga is this. This is essentially what I'm going to be talking about, is yoga, my journey through it, and the things that have come up along the way, and the little tidbits and stuff. And I think this has actually been quite a good introduction for myself, because I am very much all over the place. My mind goes from point to point to point, and then maybe we'll go back, as I maybe said earlier on, I can't even remember. But I'd like it to keep that way. I don't want it to be so scripted that it seems overly edited or overly polished, because I don't like that. If you were to come and listen to me talk in person, you wouldn't get an edited or a polished version. You would get the version of me that is sitting in front of you and able to look at me eye to eye, you know, and see me directly, and know that I stutter, that my brain gets, you know, stuck on words, or it goes completely blank at times. You get that feel for me, and I want that to transfer on this as well in the podcast. And this is something I'll be working towards on all of my online content as well, is that I don't want to over edit it. I want you to see all the pitfalls and like me tripping up over my words and me talking absolute shite, because I think it's funny, and you're seeing a real version of me. I think this world is too polished as it is, and especially the yoga world. It is so polished, and there's so much of it that is just so fake and not real and not authentic, that I think it's really important to expose myself in all of the good, the bad, the ugly parts of this journey, the ugly parts of myself, but also the wonderful parts that's come with it, or the wonderful things that I've come to understand. And I think that's where I'm going to leave this one. I don't want these episodes to run too long. I want them to be quite manageable, you know, not like 2-3 hour episodes, because that really does my head in, is when you find a really good podcast and all the episodes are 2 hours long. So with that being said, I'm going to cut it short just now. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again, or not to see you again, obviously, but thanks for listening, thanks for being here, and you'll maybe hear my voice again soon. Who knows? Have a wonderful rest of your day.